if you've just tuned in, it is time for another episode of AI Africa, your antenna in tech on the continent. My name is Tshepiso Kobile, and in this week's segment, we take a look at venture capital stats that show a large majority flowing straight into Southern Africa's information and communication technology sector, also known as ICT. To find out why, we will be speaking to the CEO of Southern Africa Venture Capital and Private Equity Association, an organization that manages 205 billion rand in assets. But first, Chanel AI, Africa's first AI newsreader, is standing by with your update on what's trending in AI.
Thanks, Kimo. And here's a wrap of what's trending in AI. Global rating agency Moody's announced earlier this week that it will use generative artificial intelligence to help staffers in writing and analyzing vast troves of data and reports. Moody's says it is providing employees with large language models from Google Cloud that will quickly sift through both public documents databases to assist them in writing analysis. The company's chief product officer Nick Reed says, open quote, the aim is to enable a wider range of staffers to work on projects that previously would have required expertise in fields such as coding, finance and accountancy, close quote. And finally, multinational tech giant Google partnered with an AI-based organization headed by Right to Care, a not-for-profit entity with extensive experience in TB, with the common goal to make AI-powered TB screenings widely accessible across sub-Saharan Africa, by commitment to conduct 100,000 free AI-powered TB screenings. Data from the World Health Organization ranks South Africa among the top 5 countries in the world with the highest burden of TB, with more than 500 cases per 100,000 population. That's all from me, Chanel AI. You're up to date. Over to you, Kimo.
Now that you know what is trending in AI, it's time to see what's trending in ICT-related investments on the continent. In their 2023 Venture Capital Industry Survey, the Southern African Venture Capital and Private Equity Association says just over 530 million rand of a total 1.12 billion rand in money invested was held by the local ICT sector. To discuss what it is about local tech innovation that has investors so excited, I am joined by the association's CEO, Tshepiso Kobile, for more. Kobile, thank you so much for joining us. Now, although the survey...
Thank you for having me. Sure.
Now, although the survey notes a contraction in VC deals by over 10% since the prior year, this year's number is a large jump from the 39.6% reported in the 2022 survey. Why the sudden surge in investor interest in local tech?
Lovely to be on the show, and thanks for having me, Guillermo. Yes, you're quite right that if one looks at the deals, the value of deals that were invested in by local VC, there was a slight contraction in 2022. But what was good to see was that if one looks at overall value investments, we're still sitting at over 1.1 billion of money that is going into early stage entities from the VC fund managers. And as you've mentioned, a big chunk of that went into the ICT space. It's a sector that we've seen dominating VC investments for well over a decade now, actually. About 10 years ago in 2022, it accounted for about 36% of VC investments, and this year we're seeing it taking up to 48%. And it's not really surprising if one thinks about it, because it is a sector that lends itself very well to VC if one considers that VC traditionally looks for high growth sectors where there's the ability to scale up quite quickly, there's the ability to access untapped markets, and through innovation, there is that ability to disrupt. So, and ICT, those are the characteristics of the ICT sector.
Now, do you see the ICT sector maintaining its spot as the #1 venture capital investment hotspot in the Southern African region? What I want to know is, are SAVCA stakeholders echoing their continued interest?
Absolutely. We do expect this trend to continue well into the future, because If one just looks at the fundamentals of what's driving the growth of ICT on our continent, we have got a highly urbanized population that is young. We've got a rising middle income that is spending a lot. So you've got these fundamental areas that are really ripe for investment. And so we don't think that any of those are going to shift. It's a sector that has been growing at a growth rate that far exceeds our pedestrian economic growth as a country. And if one also looks at within ICT, the subsectors that are particularly interesting for investors, you can start to see how and why that trend is likely to continue. Because we saw, for example, that fintech featured quite strongly as a subsector, software featured strongly, and in areas such as business products and services and consumer products and services, as much as we saw those come strongly, what we're seeing is that to a large extent, applications are being adopted even within those sectors. We also saw the health services sector come through quite strongly as a subsector, and we think a lot of that is being driven, for example, by medical devices as well as software to enable both health services and education.
Now, moving over to the journey from a grassroots to a fully fledged ICT company worthy of investment. What is SAVCA seeing about the success rate when it comes to ICT startups and what it takes to attract venture capital in the broader industry?
I think what we are seeing is that it takes an ecosystem, because if one thinks about the growth journey that any entrepreneur, ICT or other, has to undertake, there's a lot of help that has to happen to support them. And that covers a number of areas, whether it is regulatory, in the sense that startups are going to need an enabling regulatory environment. And as they also evolve from where they're at to a stage where they're ultimately able to access venture capital. In that growth trajectory, there's a need for incubators, there's a need for accelerators, there's a need for mentorship, there's a need for venture capital putting in capital, but also helping those entrepreneurs access new markets. So they use a lot of their networks. They deploy a lot of their skills into those companies, governance skills at times, as well as their experience. So what we see as the value creation process from a VC perspective really goes far beyond them putting capital into these entities. And I think what we're seeing is interest for ICT is local and international, is from local and international investors, which makes sense if one considers where we're at as a continent and our ability to really start attracting that foreign capital.
Now, speaking about venture capital, particularly in the Southern African region, it is known to have a high risk premium. What is it about local tech that is changing this perception, one? And are you seeing more bankable projects or factors that are attractive to de-risking returns in the ICT space?
Yeah, so this conversation of perceived risk, I think, is quite a big one, especially if one is talking about the ability to attract foreign capital and the perceptions that may exist around risk. And where I think ICT lends itself very well into this conversation is the fact that, firstly, it is a high growth sector. We're seeing that already. It is also a sector, if one thinks about it within our context, you've got entrepreneurs or businesses that are really delivering products and services with a very high localization element. A lot of these companies are developing solutions that we need on the ground in the country. And that is a risk mitigant in and of its own because you're developing for the local market. So that we see as a big risk mitigator. Also, what we see is because of the low barriers to entry, that also helps to de-risk as well. We've also seen within the ICT space and broadly what we're seeing within venture capital is that there are different avenues for investors to mitigate their risk. whether they co-invest alongside existing VC fund managers or they use a fund of funds model, which then really almost gives them diversification benefits. We also have, for example, one VC player that is looking at launching an index, which will make it easier for money to come in. So there's a lot of innovation that is going into the sector to de-risk it holistically at a sector level. But I think ICT specifically also plays a big role in terms of how it operates as a risk mitigant.
Lastly, Tshepiso, before you go, it has been almost a year since you assumed the role of CEO at SAVCA, and you also have an extensive background in the financial services. In your combined experience of the two, would you say you're optimistic about the future of fintech in Southern Africa?
I am absolutely optimistic about private markets. I'm optimistic about venture capital and the role that it plays in our economy, the impact that it can have from a job creation point of view, from a ease of doing business point of view for our local entrepreneurs and enabling them to grow globally. I'm excited about fintech. I mean, we live in a country where, as much as we've got quite a sophisticated financial services industry, there is a lot that is being done from a fintech point of view, from an insurtech point of view. And a lot of that really is leveraging what has been invested already, technological applications that are already there, but there's a lot of innovation that is going into using them to make sure that they are relevant for our environment. So I'm quite excited about the fintech space, and I'm excited about the impact that our local entrepreneurs within the ICT space are going to have in terms of just ensuring that there's growth, there's employment, there's efficiencies and access to services like financial access, access to education, access to health, etc.
Many thanks to you for joining us today. That was SAVCA CEO Tshepiso Kobile for another episode of AI Africa.